Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's launch day review of the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1070 Ti, a new graphics card that fits between the 1070 and the 1080. I have 34 benchmark results for you gaming and non-gaming, stock and overclocked later in this video. But first I'm going to talk about what the card is, what the price is, how it compares to these, and whether or not you should consider buying one. Now first, without diving into too much technical detail, essentially it splits the difference between the 1070 and the 1080. Currently in November of 2017 when I'm filming this, GTX 1070 cards start at $400 and GTX 1080 cards start at $500. This card is launching for $450, at least in the US. It does have more core count. It has almost the same CUDA cores or processing power as the 1080, but it has the VRAM, the video RAM of the 1070. It has GDDR5, not the GDDR5X that the 1080 has, and that is going to show up in the benchmarks that I'm going to show you later in the video. That's really what's holding the performance back. Now, it is worth noting that none of these cards come factory overclocked. In fact, NVIDIA laid the hammer down and told all the board partner cards, including MSI here, to only ship these at the stock default clock speeds. Not to worry, I have overclocked results for you. These are in fact unlocked. Yes, you can overclock them. I put a 175 megahertz overclock on this, taking it straight to 2 gigahertz. It ran just fine. Both of these cards ran at 2 gigahertz, so we have an even across the board 2 gigahertz clock speed on all three cards in the benchmark results, as well as the stock speeds, which is closer to 1.8 as it comes out of the box, as all the cards do, not just MSI, but EVGA, Zotac, Gigabyte, etc. All of the 1070 Ti's will ship at the same default speed, but all are overclockable. In a result that should surprise absolutely nobody whatsoever, the 1070 Ti is faster than the 1070 and slower than the 1080. Well, of course it is. It wouldn't happen any other way. That being said, the real question, of course, is how much faster is it than the 1070 and how much slower than the 1080? And of course, those results will be later in the video. Yes, even when you overclock this, it's still not as fast as the 1080 is, but it does get close in some situations. Before we get to 34 benchmarks, let me give you some general buying advice. Now I'm going to separate this into 1080p, 1440p, and 4K recommendations, standard 60 frames per second, as well as high refresh rate gamers, and then a brief note about ultra-wide monitors. First up, for 1080p gaming, if you simply want to play all the latest and greatest games at high detail preset 1080p 60 frames per second, you don't need any of these cards. A 3GB GTX 1060 will do that just fine for a lot less money. But it won't do it for 3 or 4 years. At this point, you might get 18 months out of a $200 GTX 1060 3GB card, 1080p high detail, in the then current games that come out, say, next Christmas or early in 2019. If you'd like to extend that out to 3 years, then a 1070 or a 1070 Ti might be worth buying, because the extra performance these cards give you, you may not need today, but you'll grow into them at 60 frames per second. So if you're looking for a 3-year card, yes, the extra money may very well be worth it. Now that's 60 frames per second. What about 100 or 144 hertz monitor users? If you have a 144 hertz monitor and you want to play games at 144 frames per second, look closely at the benchmark charts. I do include 1080p high detail preset numbers here. We are in fact testing on an i7-8700K overclocked to 5 gigahertz. I can't give these cards any more benefit. I'm giving them the best gaming CPU in the world right now. Notice how many games even the GTX 1080 cannot run at 144 frames per second. If you want the best of the best, if you really want high refresh rates, you need a fast processor, and a 1080 Ti, yes, it's expensive, it's $700 plus, is not overkill. It's really hard to push 144 frames per second. Now, if you have a G-Sync monitor, then a 1070 or 1080 is a reasonable choice, because the monitor will use its variable refresh rate technology to sync itself to the card. So if the card is only doing 100 to 120 frames per second and you want a smooth experience, a G-Sync monitor will let you do that with these cards, even if they don't quite maintain 144 frames per second. But if you want 144, get a 1080 Ti. If you have an ultra-wide 1080p monitor, 2560 by 1080p rather than 1920 by 1080p, then a 1070 might actually make a lot of sense. The ultra-wide 1080p monitors have almost 50%, not quite, but almost 50% more pixels to push than a standard 1080p, and a GTX 1060 is really starting to stretch it. It'll do it, but you'll have to compromise the details. A 1070 is 50% faster than a 1060, basically giving you 1060-like performance on an ultra-wide. What about 1440p? Now, 1440p standard is 3.6 million pixels. 1440p ultra-wide is 5 million pixels. Let's get ultra-wide out of the way right now. If you want to play current AAA games, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Mass Effect Andromeda, the upcoming Battlefront 2, and you want to play them on an ultra-wide 3440 by 1440p monitor, you really might want to consider a GTX 1080 Ti. I know they're expensive. They're $200 to $250 more than a 1080, but if you can afford it, you're going to get a lot more years of use out of it. These will need an upgrade on those screens much sooner, especially if you have one of the premium ones. If you have one of the 100Hz ultra-wide 1440p panels, 1080 Ti or bust. It is as simple as that. Now, coming down to 60 frames per second at standard 1440p, which is 3.6 million pixels, would I still buy a 1070? Yes, if you're budget strapped. I would buy a 1080 if you can afford it. You're going to get an extra year of use out of this, in my opinion, or at least 6 more months. It does, in fact, have more performance, and when you're pushing that many pixels, I do think the 1080 makes a lot of sense. Now, the 1070 can certainly last you for probably 2 years at that resolution before it's time for an upgrade. I'm just kind of thinking maybe you can squeeze 3 years out of a 1080. Notice in all this back and forth conversation, I don't seem to mention the 1070 Ti a whole lot. It's kind of an in-between card. It's faster than that, but it lacks the high-speed VRAM of the 1080. And most of these cards are actually more than 450, at least on launch day. There are a few for 450, but many of them are way too close in price to the 1080. Now, as I said before, price affects purchase decisions. If these drop in price in a couple of weeks and you can find one of these for $20, $30 more than a 1070, yes, by all means, buy the 1070 Ti, of course. But if it's $50, $60, $70 more than a 1070, it doesn't remotely make any sense. Likewise, if it is $50, $60, $70 more for the 1080, yeah, the 1070 Ti makes sense. But if you look at the same model, and by the same model I mean a Gaming or Gaming X or a For the Win or whatever, if you're looking at the same model card and there's only a $30 price difference between the 1070 Ti and the 1080, buy the 1080. It is faster, as you'll see in just a minute in the benchmarks. That leads us to 144Hz 1440p monitors. If you have one, there frankly is no conversation to be had. A GTX 1080 Ti is really your only choice. It is worth noting that 144Hz is harder to do at 1440p than 60Hz is at 4K. It's nearly 30 million pixels per second more to play a game at 144 frames per second at 1440p, 3.6 million, than it is to play at 60 frames per second at the 8.3 million pixels of 4K. So when you look at the 4K benchmarks later in this video, keep in mind that is less demanding than 144 frames per second at 1440p. You really can't overbuy your GPU if you're playing at this level. If you're playing with a high quality monitor, you want to play at high refresh rates or high resolutions, you are not overbuying to buy a 1080 Ti. I've recommended it before, I'll do it again. I know at $700+ they are expensive, but a GTX 1080 Ti is a solid 35+% faster, sometimes 45 depending on the game, than the 1080. It is a larger jump from the 1080 to the 1080 Ti than it is from the 1070 to the 1080, not even considering the 1070 Ti, which is a very minor difference, all things considered. So the $700+ those cost is not wasted money if you simply want to play high refresh rates, high resolutions, and have your card last longer than 18 months. And of course, having given that big speech, when we talk about 4K monitors, again, there's really only one choice, a 1080 Ti. Yes, you absolutely can play games with less than a 1080 Ti. Now, esports games, of course, will play on much less of a graphics card. You could play League of Legends at 4K on a $100 GTX 1050, but I don't think most people watching this video are only interested in League of Legends. You want to play Overwatch? Actually, Overwatch will play at 4K on a 1070 just fine, but that's an esports title. Destiny 2 will play just fine on one of these cards cards at 4K. But if you want to play the upcoming Battlefront 2 at ultra detail at 4K, you're not going to be doing that on a 1070. You really need a 1080 Ti to get the best experience. Now, pure gaming is great, but not everybody buys their graphics card just for gaming. First up, there's live streaming. If you play games at 1080p resolution and you want to live stream, skip the 1060, get a 1070 at a minimum, and you might want to consider a 1080 for its faster VRAM. If you are live streaming using your GPU as the encoding device and or also recording locally to the hard drive while you're playing the game, the faster video card will definitely help with that. If you're doing 1440p gaming while live streaming, whether you're live streaming at 1080p or 1440p, say to YouTube, for example, definitely skip the 1070 cards and go to the 1080 again for the faster VRAM. It lets the card internally multitask and encode, stream, record locally, and play the game better at the same time. A 1080 Ti is not wasted. I've played many games at 1440p during my live streams using a GTX 1080 Ti, and I turn VSync on to limit it to 60 frames per second, and the graphics card is still 100% utilized because I use the graphics card for local encoding to save it to my hard drive and to control the stream and to play the game. So 1440p, high detail, VSync locked to 60 frames per second. Most games that I've played, 100% utilize a 1080 Ti. Even games like XCOM 2, which are not normally GPU-bound games, they're more CPU-bound games. World of Warships, for example, is another one. It comes off of it sometimes, even when I'm not playing AAA games. So for 1440p, 1080 Ti. For 1080p, you could go with any of these. If you can afford it, get a 1080. The faster VRAM makes a difference. One quick note on overclocking before I take you to the benchmark charts. These cards run closer to 1.8 gigahertz out of the box. These two particular ones run at 2 gigahertz, but they're for the win overclocked cards. Not all 1070 and 1080 cards do, but these do. All the 1070 Ti's at launch run closer to 1.8. If you want to run them at 2 gigahertz, if you want to get the overclocked results that you see in this video, download MSI Afterburner. Make sure you download the beta. I'll put a link to it in the description below. Yes, I know it's called a beta. It's fine. I've been using it for weeks. The non-beta version is not supported by the latest version of Windows 10. It'll come up with an error message if you try to install it. When you open up MSI Afterburner, there are several sliders. The only one you have to concern yourself with is the GPU clock speed. NVIDIA uses an offset. Click on it on the 0 and type in 175, press enter, and then click the big checkbox to actually put it into place. That's all there is to it. Now, you will need to run MSI Afterburner each time you start your computer up, and you can actually set it to run on startup in the options if you want to. That will increase all of the 1070 Ti's to about 2 gigahertz. Please note that overclocking is not guaranteed. One of the reasons why they make these overclocked cards from the factory is you're guaranteed to get 2 gigahertz. All these cards run at 2 gigahertz because they're sold that way. That's what you pay the extra money for. But this is a gaming, not a Gaming X. You'll notice there's no X on the box. There are Gaming and Gaming X versions of the 1070 and the 1080. But there is not currently a Gaming X version of this because all the X cards are factory overclock cards, and NVIDIA is not letting MSI do that, which is why it just says gaming. If that changes in the future and you find a Gaming X, it'll be a factory overclock card. So download MSI Afterburner, put in a plus 175, give it a try. If your system crashes, try a 150 or try a 125. You may or may not get exactly 2 gigahertz. You can try more if you like. You can try a 225 if you'd like to try to maybe go to 50 megahertz over 2 gigahertz. It's not going to make a big difference, but you can if you want to. Enough of that. On with the benchmarks. The first 4 benchmark results I'm going to show you are 3DMark. It is a synthetic 3D benchmark that does a really good job of testing each resolution. TimeSpy on the left-hand side is a DirectX 12 modern benchmark, and then we have Firestrike, Firestrike Extreme, and Firestrike Ultra. Firestrike is 1080p, Firestrike Extreme is 1440p, and Firestrike Ultra is 4K. You can see down on the bottom I've got all 4 results laid out. The 2 blue ones are going to be the 1070 and 1080 for the Win EVGA cards, and then the 2 green ones, this will stay consistent through all the charts, are the MSI GTX 1070 Ti, stock in light green, and then overclocked in darker green. And again, the overclock is to 2 gigahertz on the actual chip itself. you can see a very clear stair-step pattern here in terms of performance. The 1070 Ti is faster even at stock than a 1070. It's even faster still overclocked, but it is not as fast as a 1080. This is pretty much going to be the results you see through this, so we will go through these charts pretty quickly, but this right here kind of lays it all out in one simple chart. This is PCMark 10 Standard. This is a Windows desktop benchmark, and this is the exact opposite of what I just showed you. This here is video conferencing, document viewing, watching videos, Skyping, image editing, that sort of thing, spreadsheets. There is no appreciable performance in terms of the Windows desktop using web browsers, using normal Windows applications between these cards. Yes, there is a little bit of image editing, a little bit of video editing in this benchmark, but not enough to make any difference, and certainly not any that uses these cards. This is all a CPU-based test. So for non-gaming tasks on the Windows desktop, it makes not one bit of difference which of these cards you buy. Are you interested in virtual reality? Now, all of these cards are great for current VR games. If you have an HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift headset, a GTX 1070 absolutely meets the requirements. The Orange Room test on the left-hand side in VRMark tests current games on the current VR headsets. The Blue Room on the right is a future benchmark. It's designed for the next generation of VR headsets. The reality is none of the current cards on the market actually pass the Blue Room test, not even a 1080 Ti. You can see they're all packed in there pretty close. There is still, however, a real performance difference between the 1070, the 1070 Ti, and the 1080 here. In the Orange Room, the 1080 is 20% faster than the 1070. In some games and applications, that won't matter, but if you're right on the edge in terms of frame rates, if you're wanting to play the next generation of games that bridge the gap between these two tests, maybe the extra $100 the 1080 costs is well worth it. Certainly if you've bought a VR headset, I'd get a 1080. The Unigine benchmarks are very popular. In fact, the Heaven benchmark has been used by a lot of reviewers for a lot of years, so I include it here mostly for historical purposes and because it's very synthetic. It's just graphics benchmarking. It basically tests how good your graphics card is. There are 3 tests here: Heaven on the Extreme preset, Valley on the Extreme preset, and Superposition, the brand new one, on the Medium 1080p preset. Again, just like the 3D Mark test, you can see a very clear stair-step pattern here in terms of performance. These benchmarks also provide a score in addition to just the actual raw frame rate. In the Superposition, the new test, for example, the GTX 1080 is 25% faster than the 1070, with of course the 1070 Ti falling right there in the middle, whether it's overclocked or not. Again, this is just designed to compare relative performance. These 3 benchmarks are free. Download them yourself, give them a try, see how well your machine does. Higher score, more performance. Next up, we have 8 games tested. Each game gets its own slide. I'm going to put each slide up for 30 seconds apiece and just talk through them, because if I read off all the numbers here, this will be a ridiculously long video. Instead, if you want to see any of the numbers in detail, pause the video and look at the chart. I included all 3 main resolutions, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. The reason for this, not that 4K is realistic on these cards, but I put it there because I thought people might be interested in seeing just how much performance really dropped when you try to run 4K, at least in modern AAA games on these cards. That's why I said earlier it's really a 1080 Ti. Please note also that 1440p here represents standard 1440p, not ultra-wide. Ultra-wide is going to be in between the 1440p and the 4K numbers here. And as far as frame rate goes, well, that's simply a matter of looking at the numbers, because I tested all of these with VSync and G-Sync off. So you're looking at Farcry Primal, although it's about to change here. We're going to take a look at For Honor now. You can see that the 1070 for the win averaged 156 frames per second at 1080p high detail. Awesome. If you have a 144 Hz monitor, you can certainly play this particular game at 144 frames per second, at least average. Notice the minimum dropped down to 128 frames per second, but still very playable. If you have a 144 Hz 1440p monitor, notice it averages 99 with a minimum of 79. That's where you can kind of use this chart to figure out, depending upon what the refresh rate of your monitor is, what kind of frame rate you want to get while you're gaming. Here's Ghost Recon Wildlands. Even with the GTX 1080, you only get 114 frames per second at 1080p. Now that's overkill if you have a 60 Hz monitor, but if you have a 144 Hz monitor, a GTX 1080 Ti is not wasted at 1080p, at least for the latest and greatest games. One question that's bound to come up in the comment section, so I'll go ahead and address it here. Where are the RX Vega numbers, RX Vega 56 and RX Vega 64? Those will be coming soon. I have those cards. I will be doing a review of them very soon, sometime in November, maybe a week or two after this video posts. I'll include these numbers and add the Vega 56, Vega 64, and probably the Vega 64 liquid-cooled numbers just to make these charts very complete. I'm then going to circle back around and cover the 1080 Ti again. I've got a couple of new 1080 Ti's to cover, and you're going to get some very busy benchmark charts with an awful lot of results. Now, I managed to talk right through it, but the numbers in GTA 5 were kind of squirrely because at 1080p at high detail, the game actually starts stuttering. It's frame limited to 189 frames per second, and it bounces into that, and there's some stutter going on. Frankly, that game could have the detail turned up to very high in Ultra, and it would be just fine. GTA 5 will actually play at 4K just fine on these cards, and Rainbow Six Siege will as well. Coming right here to Rise of the Tomb Raider, it won't. You see we're down here at 48 frames per second. It does 60 at 4K average to be sure, but the minimum is down at 43, and it's choppy. This is the built-in benchmark. I wouldn't play this at 4K. At 1440p, it's amazing and wonderful, and frankly, all these cards do just fine. Notice the minimum is quite a bit higher, though, with either the overclocked 1070 Ti or the 1080. It's a big jump there in the minimum frame rate. Finally, we come to The Division, and this game more than any other simplifies the whole thing. Do you want the premium, ultra, max, amazing 1080p gaming experience? A GTX 1070 is not a waste. A 1080 is nice. Do you want to play at 1440p at high detail? This is a great card. It does not maintain 60 frames per second as a minimum, but it gets really close and it averages well over 60. It's just a perfect example of everything I said earlier in the video about my recommendations for what these cards are good for. I've done an absolute ton of testing to come to these conclusions. Well, there you have it. 34 of the most exciting benchmark charts you've ever seen. Well, sort of. Very clean stair step. 1070 to Ti to 1080. It is pretty straightforward. If it were my money, what would I buy right now on launch day? I would buy the $509 MSI GTX 1080 Duke. It's available on Newegg, and that's going to change, of course, at some point in the future. But when I filmed this video, not only was it the least expensive 1080 available on Newegg, but it's also one of the fastest. It's a factory overclock card. It's got a big, huge, heavy cooler on it, triple fans. It overclocks nicely. I've previously reviewed the Ti version of that card, and it's black and white, so it doesn't have the red if you're not interested in the red. If I was buying a card right now and I wanted the most performance for my money, that's actually the card that I would buy. Any of the factory overclocked 1080s are really the sweet spot in my opinion. Now, when the 1070s eventually drop in price, and they were available earlier in the summer for about $350 or so, then they were the better deal. But currently they're not. The cheapest one is the Zotac Mini for $400, and it's not going to be clocked as high as this 1070 for the win is. But then again, the 1070 for the win is also not $400. Go figure. Now, I realize all that advice is going to age really fast. I hope you take everything I've said and apply it to whatever the current prices are at the time that you watch this video. Speaking of which, like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section. Please use those links in the video description. I would certainly greatly appreciate it. As I said before, they will go to Amazon and Newegg for all of the cards, not just these, but for all of the cards. Buy the one that makes the most sense for you. Buy the one that gives you the most price to performance. If it only is $20 or $30 to step from here to here or from here to here, by all means do so. If it's $50 or $60, it's probably not worth it, but the choice is up to you. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.